If you read a little bit about Soviet tanks, you'll probably find out about a certain naming convention. For example, the T followed by a number means the year the tank was made. So T-44 was made in 1944. T-43 was made in 1943. T-34 was made in 1934. Wait, no, hold on, that's not right. Well, the thing is, if you read a little bit more, you'll find out that this convention is actually wrong. But how wrong is it? Today, I decided to go through the Soviet tank catalog and calculate what the correlation is. If you guessed the year of the tank's production to be its number, how wrong would you be? For the purposes of this calculation, I'm going to only count tanks that are called T something, so no BT2s, no KV1s, only good old fashioned Ts. I'm going to start from the beginning and kind of work my way through the end of the Soviet Union, and then we can see where the numbers are actually pretty close and where the numbers are very far off. Since quite a few tanks were called T something, I'm going to focus on the ones that were actually accepted into production. But if there were some that were really way off or actually really close, I'm going to mention those as well, but they won't be included in the math. All right, so let us begin with the advent of Soviet tank building, back even before there was such a thing as a Soviet Union and only a Soviet Russia. The first Soviet tank was called the Russian Renault. It was a copy of a captured French Renault FT. Now, the Russian Renault did not get a number, neither did its replacement, the Teplоход An. But there was eventually a tank design that did get a number, the T-16, which was a small infantry support tank. The T-16 was eventually developed into the improved T-18, which was accepted into service as the MS-1, Малое сопровождение, or small support. I have a whole video about the MS-1 tank, but the important thing here is its index, T-18. The tank was not accepted into service in 1918, of course. Even the T-16 was only built in 1927, and then the MS-1 or T-18 was also accepted in 1927. So if you guessed that it was made in 1916 or 1918 based on its serial number, based on its number, you'd be almost 10 years off. As you may have figured out, the index was simply sequential. I'm not sure what the first 15 designs were. They were probably lost to history. The T-17, for example, was a tankette based on the T-16, but the design never panned out. It was never accepted into service. The numbering system continued even after the T-18. So T-19 and T-20 were attempts to modernize the T-18 to make it go faster by improving its engine and its running gear and its suspension. Ultimately, those really didn't go anywhere. Those were also those were also developed in the 1920s. Development of this program ended in the early 1930s. All these numbers were sequential and had nothing to do with the year the tank was made. The sequential numbers of prototypes continued until you got all the way to 24. The T-24 was an upgrade of the earlier T-12 medium tank. Now the T-12 was not accepted into service. I'm not counting it as a part of my calculations. But the T-24, well, it was kind of accepted into service. Ultimately, it was not successful. However, an order for 300 units was actually placed. So I am going to count that. The tank was ordered in 1930. So T-24 to 1930, still 6 years off. The order was never actually filled because the BT tank was built at the factory that was supposed to build the T-24. So I'm still going to count it. By the way, the T-24 was flanked by the T-23 and the T-25, which were also unsuccessful tankette designs on the chassis of the MS-1. Soviet tank building ran out of original ideas by 1930. As I mentioned, the T-19 and T-20 really didn't go anywhere, and the T-24 was also a very, very difficult and complicated project. And so they went abroad for inspiration. I'm not going to get into the what this expedition did. It's probably better for another video. But you probably know that they came back with Vickers designs, with Cardinal Lloyd designs, and with Christie designs. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about Christie because the Christie tanks were accepted into service under the designation BT, BT2, BT5, BT7, etc. But the British designs, interestingly, got T numbers. So the Vickers Mark E was put into production as the T26. Again, sequential number after the T25 tankette. The Cardinal Lloyd tankette was put into production as the T27. And then the T28 was kind of interesting. The thing is that the Soviets did want to buy the British, the Vickers 16-tonner tank with the big turret on top and two little machine gun turrets. Vickers would not sell them this tank, or rather, it would sell them the tank, but under very, very bad terms that the USSR was not willing to accept. So the T-28, it's based on the idea of the Vickers 16-tonner, but it's not a licensed copy like the T-26 and T-27 were. But I digress. The important thing here are the numbers, 26, 27, and 28. These tanks were actually accepted into service in 1931 and 1932, so if you used the numbers as a substitute for the production year, it'd still be about 5 years off. Now, interestingly enough, so far the numbers have been below the year number, but there were also tanks that went above. For example, the T-37 tank was much like the T-28, loosely based on a Vickers design rather than a copy of it. In this case, the Vickers amphibious tank. The T-37A was accepted into service in 1932, and its successor, the T-38, since the naming convention was sequential, was actually accepted into service in 1936, and I think this is the closest we've seen so far. The difference between 36 and 38 is actually not that much, so the numbers of tanks were catching up to the years. So as you can see, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the numbers, while plausible, were quite far off from the actual production years. There are many, many prototypes that I didn't mention, but, well, the rule of thumb remains is that these numbers were entirely sequential. They had nothing to do with the year that the tank entered production or entered service or entered development. And if the numbers are close, well, it was just kind of a coincidence. At this point, let's skip forward a little bit to the T-34. As I mentioned in my intro, the T-34 was not accepted into service or production or anything in 1934. And in fact, the tank had not even been envisioned at that point. I've seen a lot of claims that, well, T-34, the number 34, stands for when the tank entered development, when Koshkin had the idea for the T-34. But, well, that's not really the case. In the mid-1930s, the USSR was really only putting Christie tanks into production rather than descendant of the Christie design like the T-34. Really, the T-34, the requirements for this tank come out of the Spanish Civil War. Now, you can read about that in great detail in my book, Designing the T-34, but for now, suffice it to say that in 1934, nobody really had any idea or any desire that was synonymous with the T-34 tank. The actual name T-34 only comes up in 1939 when the tank is accepted into service. To quote the order, T-32 tank tracked with the V2 diesel engine produced by Factory 183 with the following changes. Increase the thickness of the main armor plate to 45 millimeters. Improve visibility from the tank. Install the following armament. F-32 76mm gun with a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. A separate 7.62mm machine gun for the radio operator, a separate 7.62mm machine gun, an AA 7.62mm machine gun. This tank will be named T-34. As you could probably tell from this decree, the name T-32 was another name for the T-34's predecessor, called A-32 at the factory, and the T-34 was, of course, called A-34 at the factory. You'll see that there's a missing number. Well, as usual, this number did apply to something. It was called A33. predictably enough. The A-33 was an experimental half-track. This wasn't an armored vehicle, it wasn't a tank, but it still entered production as the ZIS-33 at a different factory. So the numbers are filled. Now, in terms of sequence, you might say, okay, T-34, then you must do T-35, right? Well, the T-35 that we know and love, there's the 5-turret heavy tank. It was preceded by a completely different T-34. This was a small light tank rather than the medium tank accepted into service in 1939. So the indexes were sequential, but the USSR was definitely not above reusing them. This, of course, applied to other indexes as well. For example, there was more than one KV-3, there was more than one IS-2, but all that is out of scope for this particular video. So we do actually see a very good correlation here, not with the T-34, but with another tank accepted with the same decree. So, as I mentioned, the T-37 and then the T-38 tanks were these small amphibious tanks that turned out to be, by the late 1930s, quite unsatisfactory. There was another tank developed to replace them called the T-39, and wait for it, the tank accepted into service was an improved version of the T-39 called the T-40. The T-40 was accepted into service in December 19th, 1939, so only just 2 weeks away from hitting that year number. Really good, really close, still not quite correct, but the correlation is getting better and better. Now, with 1941, this is where things kind of fall apart. For one, there was a light tank accepted into service called the T-50. And then it only goes downhill from here. The T-50 is now full 10 years off the mark. But with the Great Patriotic War breaking out, the T-50 was actually quite a bit more complicated to produce than really any other light tank the USSR had. It was almost as expensive and almost as complicated to build as a T-34 tank. And so a much more simplified tank was developed that could be built at automotive factories, really anything that had any kind of production capability. This tank was a simplified T-40 tank called the T-30. So that's a full decade off in the other direction. The T-30 was improved into the T-60, which entered production in that same year. So you would be way off with the T-60, and then the T-60 was succeeded by the T-70. The T-70 was accepted into service in 1942. So at this point, you would be almost 30 years off if you were using this index. Now, the successor to the T-70, called the T-80, was also developed in 1942. So at this point, you're almost 40 years off, and naturally, this is not the T-80 that was developed, the main battle tank that was developed many decades later. Like I said, there was absolutely no qualms about reusing the numbers. And then, of course, the T-90 AA tank that was developed on the T-80 chassis, of course, also had nothing to do with the T-90 tank that was developed in the USSR in the late 1980s. So the light tanks have their own weird sequence of numbers. The medium tanks actually are a little bit more reasonable after the T-34, which, as I mentioned, had nothing to do with the year when it was built. We see the T-43 in 1942. So just 1 year off. If it was accepted into service, it probably would have been accepted into service in 1943. So we were so close to getting a match between a tank's number and the year of production. However, after the Battle of Kursk, it turned out that the requirements for medium tanks had to be increased. And so the T-43 was no more. Its successor was called T-44. And then in 1944, we finally did it. The T-44 was accepted into production, was accepted into service. And there we have it. Finally, after 20 years of the existence of the Soviet Union, even more than 20 years, you get a match between the number of the tank and the year that it was put into production. However, one small snag, this trend didn't last. The successor to the T-44 was not called T-45, it was called T-54. And the T-54 was recommended for production in May of 1945, and it did actually enter production in 1946. I have a whole video about that if you want to learn about where this tank came from and why it was put into production and why they didn't do it in 45 and waited until 46, but it doesn't matter for us. Once again, the number of the Soviet tank was about 10 years off. The T-54 was replaced by the T-55, which, okay, that's already better, and you might think that this tank was accepted into service in 1955, but almost 1957. So maybe rather than coming from the year when the tank was accepted into service, it came from the year when the tank started development, which not really. The successor of the T-55, the T-62, development began in the 1950s, and the tank was accepted into service in 1961. So again, quite close, but no cigar. You would still be wrong if you try to match the number to the year that it entered production. So here we probably get into the biggest outlier in the whole series. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to talk about tanks with letter indexes other than T, so no BTs, no ISs, but the IS series outlived the man that they were named after. After Joseph Stalin died, obviously it was a little bit of a faux pas to name anything after him, and the IS-8 tank, rather than being accepted into service under that name, was accepted into service as the T-10. Now, of course, it was accepted in service in 1953, and then you would be quite a number of decades off if you used that index, but that was a huge outlier. The number 10 was chosen because it was simply the 10th tank in the IS series, so no big mystery there. Now let's switch gears a little bit and go to Kharkov. The engineers there, they weren't sleeping either, and were working on their very own next generation tank. This tank, called Object 432, entered development in 1964, and in 1966 was accepted into service as the T-64. So in this case, the number does line up with when it entered development, but that is nothing but a coincidence. For example, the competitor to the T-64, the T-72, entered development in 1967 and was accepted into service in 1973. Both the T-64 and the T-72 were progenitors of very successful tank families that remain in service even today. Now, of course, the USSR had a third tank design center in Leningrad, and they wanted a piece of the action as well. So in 1976, a tank called T-80 was accepted into service. Their number was also quite close to the year, but, well, not really quite there. This trend would continue even with the fall of the USSR. For example, the T-90, a tank that was developed to replace the T-72, was accepted into service in 1993, so a couple of years off of the 90. The successor to the T-64, designed in Kharkov, now in independent Ukraine, was accepted into service in 2000, so quite a number of years away from when its number would suggest. So what's the trend that we see here? Over the years, there really are quite a few Soviet tanks where the number of the tank correlates quite closely with the year that it was accepted into service or accepted into production. Unfortunately, you never really hit the mark. The T-44 is really the only tank that matches up. For everyone else, you're either a couple of years too early, a couple of years too late, or in some extreme cases, a couple of decades out. If you average out all of the differences over the 80-odd years the USSR was building tanks, you would actually see that on average, you would be 9 years off if you try to substitute the tank's model number for its production year. And even if you got rid of the outliers, you would still be about 5 years off. So in short, unfortunately, there's no shortcuts here. You can't use the tank's number to estimate when it was built. You are just going to have to memorize them all.